Hey, Colemanators, this is a very, very momentous moment because everything's happening at the same time. And I can't think of anybody who is a better candidate to explain it to us. And I couldn't, and therefore I didn't try, than Lee Smith, because one of the questions I'm going to ask Lee is the extent to which he saw it coming. It's hard for me not to think that he didn't see it coming big time. Of course, he's written two books on that end up bearing on the Ukrainian crisis, the plot against the president and the permanent coup, right?
Yeah.
Lee, welcome back. How are you?
Ron, thank you for inviting me on. We had a great time last time, and I'm sure this time will be even more formidably galvanizing. How's that?
Well,
I'm doing very well.
I will say that that's a very high standard, because when I poked around the internet, I see that everybody has Lee Smith on. So I'm going to have to do it a little bit better.
It's that week of the year that Lee Smith is everywhere. You can't escape me. No one can escape me. Yeah.
So let me start out with the topical aspect, and then we can go wherever we want.
Okay.
One of the things I had a chat with the lovely and talented Irina Tsukerman, who was actually Ukrainian-born young lawyer. Who
sure, I know Irina, and I've known her for many years. As we, our paths have crossed, and I writing about the Middle East, in particular, writing about Israel and Israel's strategic situation. So yeah, that's how Irina and I met and know each other.
Yes, and she also, she had mentioned to me she's Ukrainian-born, of course, but she also focuses on psychological warfare, as we used to call it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I discussed with her, and she had an interesting answer, and I was interested to see whether yours comports with hers, was why or how has the man who we were told was such a sophisticated master of social media messaging that he actually manipulated the election process in the US so that in 2016 Donald Trump won it because of his incredibly deft use of social media. How is it that Vladimir Putin is so behind the eight ball on messaging? I'm not weighing in on the merits of either side here, but in the psychological, in the info wars, he's losing big time. What's going on?
Yeah, because I think what's happened is since 2016, I mean, right, that's what the U.S. ruling establishment alleged, right? That Vladimir Putin controlled all the space. He had his hands on all the levers for the 2016 election. In fact, what we've really seen happening is that the ground has been prepared since 2016, mostly to point against Donald Trump and Donald Trump supporters. But insofar as Vladimir Putin was put in the middle of this, he never had a chance in messaging here in this environment in the United States, right? And I mean, Vladimir Putin is a problem. He is a dictator, like people say. I mean, look, I watched. Speaking about the Middle East, I watched Putin's moves quite closely in Syria, and also I watched how the Obama administration, and this will bring us up to the present and the earnestness with which the Biden team is now talking about Vladimir Putin. But look, the Obama administration coordinated with the Russians in Syria, right? That was the whole play, right? That the Russians were given entry into the Eastern Mediterranean for the first time in about half a century, right? So, but now Putin from the Democratic, and by the way, just to finish it up, look, he bombed schools, he bombed hospitals in Syria. There is no doubt that he will be doing the same things in Ukraine. This is not to say that I have, a strongly, firmly held position right now on the actual event. I see what's happening in Eastern Europe is a problem for American interest. It's a threat to American interest. But anyway, controlling the information space, no, it's the US press, the Western press as a whole has controlled this information space. We have to keep in mind that England, which, if you can believe it, is even more corrupt than the United States, largely on account of Russian money. The amount of Russian money that goes back and forth in London with different oligarchs paying for different services from different people. And of course, we know that Christopher Steele himself was being paid certainly by the lawyer of a Russian oligarch to do work on behalf of this Russian oligarch close to Vladimir Putin named Oleg Deripaska. So the information space is corrupted, and it's basically owned right now by Democratic Party messaging units, and this holds here and Europe.
Now, it turns out rather ironic, doesn't it, that during the Cold War, it was a lot harder for politicians to take money originating in the Kremlin or anywhere in Russia or the Soviet Union because those were communists. But now everyone is just a businessman. Everyone is just a potential international partner. So you can be completely, and for some reason, there doesn't seem to be a problem taking Chinese money, but it was always a problem taking, even though that is still Chinese, that is still communist money. So when you say that in the US, the airspace has really always been controlled by the American mainstream or corporate press, you're saying that during the Syria moment, they had no real issue with Putin because Putin was holding hands with Obama. Right.
This is it's getting complicated, but it's relevant for the present moment because there's something very important going on behind the scenes here, which we'll come up to in a second. The reason that Russia was useful for the Obama administration is because the key Obama foreign policy goal was the Iran nuclear deal, right? Why Putin was important was Obama needed the Russians to be able to sustain Iran's presence in Syria, right? Had the Iranians gotten wiped out, had they lost in Syria, it would have affected the Iran nuclear deal, right? It would have shown a couple things. It would have shown, first of all, that Iran was profoundly weak, and this would have gone against the Obama administration's selling points. Which said, no, Iran can actually manage the region as a whole. But to lose in Syria to people that Barack Obama called doctors and farmers and not really capable of putting up a real fight against the Assad regime in tandem with the Iranians, it would have made that deal fruitless, right? There would have been no point to it. So when the Russians came in to sustain the Iranians, right? While there were people on the air, while there were people in the press who were saying it's terrible what Putin is doing, bombing schools, bombing hospitals, Vladimir Putin is doing a really bad thing. The main point of the messaging was that Vladimir Putin is not such a bad guy because he's, after all, fighting ISIS. What that really means is, insofar as Sunni extremists were fighting against Iranians and Iranian allies, right, the Obama administration was going to go with Iran and its allies. And insofar as Putin was allied with them, that's all that mattered, right? ISIS, in a way, was just, again, part of a messaging operation. The real strategic threat to the United States does not come from bearded boys driving Toyotas, right? It comes from a real state with real state institutions like Iran. That's who Obama wanted to give a nuclear weapons program to. And we can go through the details on that if you want.
Right, and which Obama 3 is in the process of doing right now in Vienna. I know you want to go into those details, but before you do, I want to lay the ground for it with a fundamental question, which you almost answered, and it is, look, we know that there is a really bizarre phenomenon where, and it played itself out nowhere as powerfully as in the Middle East, where the Obama foreign policy has been to actually release or give up existing and hard-fought influence, U.S. influence.
Yes.
And to actually create a power vacuum. And in the case of the Middle East, to create a power vacuum so that Iran could step into it. You alluded to this when you said that the idea seems to be let Iran be the local hegemon.
Mm-hmm.
And there will we know that there's this idea that local hegemons maintain stability in a region,
Mm-hmm.
and we won't have to send troops and clean up the mess.
Right.
And if Iran will be that guy,
Right.
what on earth makes them think that Iran should be that guy? Not only given, let's pretend that terrorism and support for terrorism weren't
Mm-hmm.
issues, because there are virtually never issues for Democrats.
Yes.
But let's just look at Iran, first of all, is
Mm-hmm.
not Arab,
Right.
and Arabs don't like Iran as a general
Mm-hmm.
rule.
Mm-hmm.
They're Sunni.
The Arabs, I mean, yeah, right.
The Arabs are Sunni,
the
and
Middle East is a Sunni majority region.
and so in other words, there's the ethnic, there's the
Mm-hmm.
lack of ethnic match, there's the lack of religious match,
Right.
and then there, of course, there's the Israel match, which is only one of
Mm-hmm.
several mismatches. What
Right.
is the rationale that has obviously been driving the Obama crew? You know, I could just see that it was somebody's PhD thesis. That's what it smells
Mm-hmm.
like. That this is the way to achieve stability in the Middle East is to
Right.
let Iran run it. What's the think?
Well, I mean, it is actually kind of a PhD thesis, and it was the thesis of the British Empire as they started to get out of the Middle East, that there were going to be twin powers, and the twin powers that would balance the region would be Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then there was the Iranian Revolution. What a lot of people have failed to reckon with is that it was not Iran and Saudi Arabia who became the powers in the Middle East after the British left. It was the United States, right? So what's happened? The Obama administration tried to describe it as, and I imagine a lot of your listeners are saying, what does the Middle East have to do with the stuff that's going on in Ukraine? We want to get to that, and I promise that these things are tied together in a very, very significant way. The idea, so it was the United States that filled the vacuum. After Iran's 1979 revolution, right, the competition then was between the United States and Iran. Now, the way the Obama team described it was, oh, it's between Saudi and the Iranians, and the Saudis have to learn how to share the region, and the Israelis have to learn how to share the region, right? No, it was the United States. The United States was the power was the power in the region, even if there weren't hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground all the time. It was, you know, the Arabian Gulf, Persian Gulf, however we wish to describe it, was effectively an American lake, right? This is one of the vital waterways in all the world. And it was the responsibility of the United States to ensure the free flow of oil, to keep global markets functioning, to keep the price of oil down. The Obama administration's thesis was, well, first of all, we have to reckon with the fact that this thesis inflected by 1970s radicalism, right? This is what the Islamic Republic represented to 1970s radicals, right? They were waving the flag of resistance, the banner of resistance against the United States and other conservative powers.
As the Muslim Brotherhood would do 20, 30 years later, and that had an appeal
exactly
that Obama couldn't resist.
Right. Anyone who is waving the flag of resistance against the West is appealing, right, to 1970s, 1980s era radical Westerners, right? We remember that during the course of the revolution in 1979, Michel Foucault, one of the one of the fathers of this kind of Western mode of thinking, was praising the revolution and praising the Iranian regime. He eventually turned on it. God bless him. But this was a very, as much as Cuba is. So we look at the different interests of the Obama administration, reaching out to Cuba, wanting to make a deal with Iran. So it's heavily influenced by the ideas of 1970s radicalism, that this is what the Iranians would represent. They would represent a progressive force in the Middle East. And the other thing that was appealing to the Obama team was the violence. It was the terror. Obama, in a meeting with a bunch of Gulf officials, I believe it was the UAE, but with a number of Gulf officials, spoke highly about the late Quds Force commander, Qasem Soleimani, saying, well, you guys really need one of Qasem Soleimani who can keep everyone in order and really kind of manage the region. So Obama and that administration was hugely impressed by Iranian terror, that's what would help them manage the region. So again, it's 70s radicalism.
Insurgency
right.
has an appeal for them. It's being the Viet Cong.
Yes.
It's being Mao.
Absolutely. This is absolutely, look, we understand, we look at their domestic politics as well. The different people they were close to, whether it was Mr. Ayers, whether it was Reverend Wright. I mean, this banner of revolution is still very, very important. Now, at this point, I think one of the things that you're getting at is who would think of doing such a thing regarding the Islamic Republic, really trying to give them a nuclear weapons program. And again, very quickly, just to explain what I mean by that, right? The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the nuclear deal, this was never intended to stop Iran from getting a bomb, right? This was actually the first instance we saw of the echo chamber and the Obama faction's use of public messaging, basically the lie, right? We could understand Russiagate because we saw it happening with the Iran deal. The important thing to understand about the Iran deal are these things called the sunset clauses, which means different restrictions on Iran's nuclear program are due to expire over time, at the end of which Iran will have a totally legal, right, and legitimate industrial scale nuclear weapons program. The whole thing was meant to put Iran's bomb under international protection, under the umbrella of an international agreement. The idea that it was intended to stop Iran from getting a bomb is nonsense, right? It was another lie. And we can see that in the sunset clauses. So why did that administration want to empower a terror state? Why did he want to give it provide it with the deadliest weapon known to mankind? This raises a host of other questions.
I remember from international relations, when I studied it in college, that there was this concept, again, going back to stability, that there's something more inherently stable about having tension between joint hegemons than having one hegemon, because in the one hegemon, and remember, the premise here is on the left that the United States in and of itself has no moral superiority to any other hegemon. So if Israel has a bomb, it will be more stable for the region if Iran also has a bomb.
If a competing power has a bomb, right?
There was even a school of thought that said that when rogue states become nuclear states, they grow up. Because they now have to live with the maturity and responsibility of being nuclear states. And I remember that was not even in the 80s, that was not a favored approach, the non-proliferation world. But I do know that it's fascinating to me that these views of the world are never updated to reflect facts, kind of like COVID policy.
Right.
So the fact that virtually every Arab state now has diplomatic relations with the state of Israel, and that no one's really involved in lobbing in war with Israel, other than the Palestinians, who none of the Arabs like. That's not allowed to intrude on this, again, academic concept of the inherent stability. So hell with real stability. Let's go with whiteboard stability.
Right.
Okay, so this is going to happen.
Right.
and it's going to be under, just I'll be there. You talk about the big lie. The big lie, I remember when the big lie was promulgated, the big lie at the time really was better no deal, better a bad deal than no deal at all.
Mhm.
That's the dumbest, like that any adult could possibly,
Right.
everything's a bad deal.
Yeah.
The bully said, "Give me your lunch money." Okay,
Right.
here's my lunch money. Why didn't you negotiate with him? Why don't you fight back? Well, I wanted to make a bad deal because a bad deal would be better than no deal at all.
Right.
All right. So here we are now. Let's see if I can get us back into the Ukraine lane. I'll give you a shot at doing it. I think you probably have no difficulty.
Okay. Well, let me say first of all, I totally agree with your take on the bad deal. And you're a lawyer. You know much better than me. Anyone who comes back, this is the best we could do. It's like and you expect to make partner. You make a deal like this, and are you kidding me? And by the way, all the people who are negotiating are in outside of Washington. They're high-powered lawyers, right? Like Wendy Sherman. These are real lawyers. And if you came back to your firm with a deal like this and said, "Well, that's the best we can do," now you should go. And we're not even giving you a chance to pack your stuff. The fact is, this is the deal that the president of the United States wanted. He wanted Iran to have a nuclear weapons program. He wanted Iran to have sanctions relief for many hundreds of billions of dollars. That's what they wanted. Now, Donald Trump exits the JCPOA in May 2018. The Democrats are furious. They're outraged. They think that things are becoming, or they argue that things are becoming much more dangerous. In fact, Trump had the Iranians fairly well in hand. One instance of that was when he had Qasem Soleimani killed. Everyone's expecting the region to explode. It didn't explode, right? Joe Biden made it, right, a priority, a foreign policy priority to re-enter the Iran. Joe Biden, right, exactly. The late Joe Biden made it a priority to re-enter the Iran deal. Now we come to Russia and Ukraine. In 2014 and 2015, and even before 2014, the American side under Obama, they were negotiating directly with the Iranians. That's not been happening now. Who have the Americans been negotiating with over the Iran nuclear deal, over re-entering? The Russians. It's the Russians who are holding the Iranian file. That's what's going on. One way to understand what happened in Ukraine, right? We saw a press report that the Russians decided to hold off as a favor to the Chinese, who wanted to make sure that people were able to watch the Olympics without Russian bombing, the Russian onslaught of Ukraine interfering. I think a much better way to understand this is that the Russians understood what was going on, that the Biden administration so desperately wanted the JCPOA, and their hands would be tied if the Russians moved on Ukraine at this particular moment. So when the Biden administration now, as I'm sure you've seen, is going on about sanctioning the Russians for what they're doing in Ukraine. What people don't understand is that the Iran nuclear deal, because the Biden administration has done a very good job of concealing this, the Iran nuclear deal will flood Russian war chests. How? Because Iran will become a nuclear client of Russia's. The Russians will go in there and help the Iranians finish off their nuclear weapons program. They will become a weapons client of Russia, insofar as the Russians and the Chinese will sell the Iranians arms, right? They will also become an economic client, as the Russians will go in there and help them develop. So regardless of what's happening on the Ukraine front, it's important to see what the Iran nuclear deal means. It's not just about giving a terror state the bomb. It's also about empowering Vladimir Putin. So when Joe Biden says that we're really digging in against the Russians, we're really against Vladimir Putin's aggression, the thing that's going on in the background is the Biden administration is filling their war chest with money. That's what's actually happening.
Now, here's a really, really important question. And if it weren't you, I don't know if I get a straight answer from anyone else. Because a lot of people, including people like our friend Jack Posobiec, are suggesting or saying outright, this is all how it was planned. In fact, the whole reason that the invasion took place now was to provide a cover for what's going on in Vienna, and to also provide incredible opportunity for Russia to start, getting cash on hand, and for camouflaging who's the good guy and who's the bad, all these things. Now, I that's a little too conspiratorial for me. And in fact, listening to your analysis makes me question the reasonableness of that assumption, in part because we're back to Putin as Hitler. And if we want to say that international supervision of Iran is what we want, and we know that Iran is going to always be closer to Russia for reasons than to the United States, why would we want Iran to be even more tightly bound to Russia than it would have otherwise been if not for the Ukraine situation? So what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, to start at the top, I think certainly the Russians are clever enough to put it like that. I mean, it's obvious, right? I mean, the Biden administration is so desperate to get into the Iran deal, and said, let's tie this into different things. I mean, they did it before in Syria. So this is a typical Russian play, right? So it's not surprising the Russians set it up like this.
This is a tip. So in other words, moving in as a reaction to power vacuums created by, being opportunistic. What's the play?
Well, the Russians understood how much the Biden administration wanted the Iran deal. They saw that as an opportunity to move on another front, which is Ukraine. And they would understand that what's the obvious play of the United States? The first move of the US, it's never, it's a show of force with aircraft carriers and sanctions, right? Because the United States officials think that sanctions come basically, cost-free. You can just impose sanctions. So the Russians would have understood that, and they would have said, well, good, they're going to try to impose sanctions, and we're going to tell them what's going to happen if they impose sanctions. And they will understand very clearly. Do I think the Biden administration knew what was going on in that way? No, I don't think that they understood that this was a likely thing to happen. I'm sorry. What after that? What was the other thing you mentioned? Because I wanted to take them in order.
So I said, was it all planned? So the other thing I mentioned was, why would the Biden administration, if the hypothesis is it's good to have Iran's nuclear program under international supervision, it's stable, but if Putin is Hitler, why would we want to drive Putin and Iran closer together? It would seem that, going back to sort of my original premise, which was that any reduction in American influence is seen as a good thing. It's a little bit, even for the Obama team, much to go from Putin is unreasonably interfering in American politics, and he's Hitler, and he's the worst thing since sliced bread, since sliced bread with mold, I guess. To he's the guy who we should trust to keep an eye on Iran.
Yeah. They don't, no, I mean, the way that the Obama administration perceived Iran, its relationship with Iran, right, was that they were arming an ally, right? That's the idea, that the realignment of US interests meant that Iran was an ally. They were going to arm an ally. Putin is not, the way that they perceive this, it's not that Putin is an ally of Iran. Putin will help protect American interests. That's what they did in Syria. The idea was that Putin would help protect American interest, which was the alliance with Iran. So no, they don't see that the important thing is the Putin-Iranian alliance. So this is actually what's happening. But the way that they perceive it is entirely different, that Iran will be an American ally and that Putin has done things in Syria and elsewhere around the world to help advance American interests. They do not believe that Putin is Hitler. They do not believe that Putin is a fundamental problem. And I'll tell you one of the ways we know it paradoxically is the idea that they put Putin in the middle of Russiagate, right? What does that tell you? That tells you the way that they perceive Russia. They perceive Russia as a lesser power, that Russia is not a real threat, right? You know, because what would they think of doing that to China?
Right.
I mean, especially given the amount of money circulating through Washington and wherever else, New York, Hollywood,
Well, in fact,
the Academy.
that's one of the things Irina said, which was that obviously there were and probably still are Russian bot farms, and there have, of course, there's always an effort to undermine American institutions and to infiltrate them, but they didn't swing the election. What they did do was form a narrative about who Putin is, and that and by making him number two, then we forget about China. And her point was that China is the real adversary here. Forget about how many soldiers, well, actually China always has the most soldiers, but forget about the nuclear arms, and forget about the Navy. China is by far more to be feared, especially because of its integration with the American economy and corporate culture, than Russia will ever be.
I mean, it's hard to know exactly how much of this is intentional, but certainly that was the effect, right? By focusing on Russia, by making Russia America's, or certainly the Democratic Party's number one adversary, right? So it gave China a lot. It took a lot of the heat off of China. But of course, especially the Democratic Party is keen to protect its relationships with China. We're moving all around here, but you and I'll manage to tie it together. Well, because what we're seeing is the rise of a new bloc here, and that bloc is China, Russia, Iran, and other affiliated groups, like non-state actors like Hezbollah, like Hamas, and so this is the rise of a new bloc. The thing about China is that I don't like to be too partisan. Not because it's a bad show, but I believe that the Republicans are guilty of many foolish things, which we can talk about in a second. The most recent foolish thing they've done, but the Democrats are structurally pro-China, by which I mean, if you look at the Democrats cannot run campaigns without money that is directly tied to China, given that its major donors are from Wall Street, big tech, and Hollywood. That is all money tied to the Chinese Communist Party. It is dependent on solid relations between the US corporate and political establishment and the Chinese Communist Party's elites, right? So the Democratic Party cannot afford to go out on a limb against China, or even, I mean, we've seen what the Biden administration has done, right? The Biden administration's DOJ has stopped this initiative started under the Trump White House, right, to aggressively go against Chinese espionage, right? The Biden administration says, no, racist. We're not going to do that. That sounds terrible.
Also, all of a sudden, they're also losing these cases.
Yeah, right. Well, did you see the Charles Lieber case? Have you read anything about the Charles Lieber case, Boston, the Harvard professor?
Yeah.
Well, he was charged. He was charged with lying to the FBI, right? What did he lie to the FBI about? They asked him, they said, are you a member of China's Thousand Talents program, which is nothing but an espionage ring, right? Getting foreigners and getting Chinese nationals abroad to help advance the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, right? He lied about that, meaning he's actually working for the Chinese, right? But what did they charge him with? They just charged him with lying to the FBI. Why? Is it a harder case to make? Presumably. But also they don't want to shine too much light of what's really going on. And again, to talk about structural issues, there are hundreds of thousands of visa holders, student visa holders. There is no way that the 13,000 agents of the FBI can have all of these student visa holders, right, can be looking at all of these people who are stealing sensitive and in some cases classified information from the United States and passing it on to the CCP. That's structural. How do you stop students from spying on the United States? You don't ramp up the number of FBI agents, right? You cut down the number of student visa holders, but that won't happen either because of structural issues in the United States.
Pretty encouraging. So,
well, the thing is, these things can be addressed. They can be fixed and resolved once people actually get serious about the issues. But of course, we know the Biden team is not, right? And that's not because of the money that Hunter and Jim and Joe Biden were getting from CCP businessmen, right? It's about the nature of the Democratic Party. When you hear different people like, China is a challenger and a competitor. That's not the way to describe China. That's not what's happening. The other thing is, look, 2 years ago, by lying about how, when, and where COVID-19 started, by lying about the nature of transmission, at that point, COVID became, in effect, a bioweapon. We don't know whether the release was intentional or not, but it became a bioweapon after they lied about it, right? No one has held them responsible, right? The Biden administration, the DNI, the intelligence community assessment is like, we'll just never know what happened until the Chinese decide to give us information themselves. In other words, we're going to clear the Chinese. And what we're going to do is instead, 2 years after they release this bioweapon, we're going to bring the world to celebrate the Chinese Communist Party here in Beijing at the 2022 Winter Olympics. So we're talking about what incentivizes, what emboldens American adversaries. It's American leadership. It's the people who are either elected to or appointed to help manage our system. This is why American adversaries are emboldened. This is why Vladimir Putin was emboldened to move on Kiev, right? It's not just about the NATO issue. There are lots of other issues that are going on here. This is why if you're a Taiwanese patriot right now, you would be worried about what's happening. Well, the Americans never did anything about Hong Kong either. Hong Kong, Wuhan, what good is it to have an alliance with the United States? If you're sitting in Jerusalem, if you're sitting in Riyadh, if you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, and you look at how the Iran nuclear deal is going, you're thinking, what's wrong?
I mean, but our political system, going back to the most recent 2 Lee Smith books, if we have a rule that unless it's Donald Trump, foreign policy is set by the chief executive, by the executive branch.
Right.
If somebody thinks that there's a what was it? There's a multi-agency consensus.
The interagency consensus.
The interagency consensus.
As the real bright guys refer to it.
Right. So if that is different from what the president says, then that wins. But before that, there was always, if you're going to have these wild swings, because Trump's policies basically reflected, if you didn't have Obama, you'd have a fairly smooth curve, which is not, there is no real smooth curve of American foreign policy. but standing far enough back, it would be a lot smoother without the Obama era. And so they're going.
Yeah, that's true.
They're going all in.
Yeah.
And it's pretty distressing if we have to,
That's a very important point, and of course it's a delicate point because it has to be explained and you have to put detail on it. But you're right. You can say that, well, look, our problems with China go back to not so much 1972, the opening with Beijing, but what started to happen in the 90s under Bill Clinton. And this is a bipartisan issue, right? Everyone wanted to give China, everyone back then, right? And some people have gone back, like, God bless him, Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, has gone back and he's revised his ideas on this. It seems that Nixon had too. But during the 1990s, so you see a trajectory of US and China relations. It goes that way. During the Obama years, something flips. It's not just about China, it's about Iran too. And I think we have to be able to talk about it, but a lot of it does have to do with 1970s, 1980s era radicalism. And I think that right now, if we look at what's been happening to the United States, to American citizens, whether it was Russiagate, whether it's January 6th, we see that many of the people in in positions of responsibility do not like America, and they do not like Americans. And again, we're always talking about a problem with our political class, which is accurate, but something different happened during the Obama years. And I think it will become more and more important for us to dig a little deeper on that and explain why these things happen. This is a radical shift we've seen here, right? The United States foreign policy establishment wanted to reopen relations with Iran since 1979, right? Every president attempted it. So in that way, you can say, well, the U.S. has always wanted good relations with the Iranians for I think for many crazy, sentimental reasons. But the idea of giving the Iranians a nuclear weapons program, well, that's a different idea. So what happened during the Obama years?
Which we're not going to answer today, and probably not even tomorrow.
Yeah.
But standing on the outside, we can see that what it was very hard to reconcile with any traditional, at least, concept of what's good for America. In the near term, we're seeing disastrous consequences. Both, you mentioned COVID, and you mentioned the way we dealt with and addressed the reality of COVID, and the political and financial and corporate and cultural changes that have taken place. You have an entire generation of heroes, the NBA, who have come to identify their well-being with that of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
And a corporate cadre that's extremely comfortable in that space.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're back to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
As just to finish up, what Irina thought that Putin, notwithstanding all this, all his opportunism and all the things he has cutting his way, she thinks that he overplayed his hand. That he's actually, and to some extent, the terms that he apparently is offering Ukraine suggest what seems like a substantial moderation. Because those terms weren't offered beforehand, at least not publicly. So what you really have is, if we could completely master the strategic military situation in a week or 10 days, we'll reintegrate the entire Ukraine into the Soviet Union or make it a real puppet state. Now it seems that her feeling was that there has to be some kind of climb down because his supporters are getting hurt. His oligarchs are losing money. Oil alone won't make up for that. But what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, we rightly distrust the information coming out of both Russia and Ukraine because they're in the middle of a war. So this is what happens. You have propaganda coming from both sides. I would just say the information that's coming from people on our side, these are the same people who said when Putin went into Syria, right? The White House said, oh, he's entering a quagmire. Stupid Putin, how foolish. No, instead what Putin has done is they have a deconfliction mechanism with the Israelis. The Israelis don't have air superiority anymore over all of the Eastern Mediterranean, right? So the idea that Putin has entered a quagmire he can't get out of, I'm afraid we don't know these things yet. And I don't look. Another important thing to understand is this is not simply a security issue, right? It's also a territory issue, by which I mean, I think actually for all of the talk that we've had about Hunter Biden and what Hunter Biden did in Ukraine and the money the Bidens were collecting from this Ukrainian energy company under investigation, I actually think we've underplayed it. I think if you look at what's happened in many ways, the Democratic Party challenged Vladimir Putin. He challenged his own racket in Ukraine. This is a fundamental issue. So what? So Putin's oligarchs are losing some money now with and again, I don't know if that's the case. I'm sure Irina has very good information. I don't know, but I'm saying on the other side of that is that, well, they'll make more money if they control the important industries, namely, transfers, transfer fees in Ukraine. So again, it's very foggy right now, but I instinctively distrust anyone because of the information we've seen about Putin before, who says that, oh yeah, he's in a heap of trouble right now. He may be, I just counsel patience
And
from
caution.
others because we've seen it before. Just very quickly, I want to say two more things if possible. First, about the fog of war. When you hear the different things coming from the Russian side and the Ukrainian side and how it's funneled through the American press, right? You can say, well, they're at war. This is what happens. Propaganda comes from both sides. The truth is the first casualty of war. But so why does all of this sound so much like what's been fed to the American people for the last 5 years? And tragically, we now have the obvious answer because our establishment is at war with the American people, whether it was Russiagate, whether it was Kavanaugh, whether it was Ukraine-gate and impeachment, whether it's COVID, whether it's January 6th, this propaganda campaign, these operations against the American public means that our ruling establishment is at war with at least half the country, if not much, much more. That's very dispiriting.
Sure.
The other part of this propaganda campaign, just to bring it back to Ukraine and finish it off if you like, is this. The idea that the Republican Party is now intending to join the Democrats by going after Putin and by going after his energy resources is a historic blunder. Right? There's a way in which the Republicans could say, look, we're more anti-Putin than anyone. And don't believe the Democrats, because here's what's really going on in the background. But if you expect us to be on the hook for high energy prices, if you think that we're trying to punish the American working and middle class, you're crazy. Now let's get together and do something serious about Russia. But we're not going to follow along this democratic play here to make Americans suffer. Sure, would we like them to ramp up domestic production? Of course we would. They're lunatics, but it's never going to happen. And you know why? Because the Green New Deal is the most important thing to the Democrats. That's all that matters. They're never going to ramp up domestic production. So the idea that we think playing along with the Russia stuff is going to get them to ramp up domestic production is nonsense. They're going to pocket sanctions on Russia, which will be sold as we help them in a bipartisan show. We help them raise energy prices. In November, we're going to be in trouble because they're going to blame us. They're going to say, oh yeah, the Republicans had as much to do with it as the Russians. They're going to pocket that as a victory, and they will never ramp up domestic energy production because there is nothing more important, the Democratic Party platform, than the Green New Deal. And why? Because that's another instrument to destroy the American working and middle class, right? To undermine the basis of our fossil fuel economy. With the Green New Deal, this is the key. This is all they want. So GOP leaders have made an unforced blunder here.
That's what they do. That's what
exactly.
They do.
It's terrible. It's terrible for the country. It's terrible for it's terrible for the American public, for the American working and middle class. Nonetheless, I want to end on a very positive and optimistic note, which is the more and more we see the blunders of our political class, our ruling class, the more and more we must come back to the realization that we are Americans and we are responsible for leading ourselves. And there are great leaders all around this country, whether they're in media like you, Ron, whether they're some political officials, local, state, everyone talks about Ron DeSantis, phenomenal leadership in schools, in churches, in synagogues, in medicine. So it's time for us to look and understand what the country is about, to put our reliance, to rely on these people. Maybe they're not trying to sell us out. Maybe they're not. I'll give them some credit, but they're idiots. How's that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is capable psychologically to imagine them rationalizing.
Oh yeah, of course.
Not that we're selling people out. Sure, making a few bucks, but everyone's making a few bucks. Come on.
Right.
But this is for the good of the country. This is for the good of the country because really China, at the end of the day, blah, 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 blah. Lee, incredible. I just want to make it clear to everyone watching and listening, I never have to do another one of these again. Okay, this is the end. I'm culminating the ColemanNation podcast because this is it. We covered every little thing.
We got almost everything here. almost everything.
Lee, a real pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on a
Thank
short
you
notice.
so much, Ron. I really appreciate it. This is a great honor and a great treat. It's always a lot of fun speaking to you, and I look forward to doing it again before too long.
Thanks a lot. And the book, there's a book on the way out, or just the one that just came out?
Well, I'm working on one now. I'm not going to talk too much about it now, but I will say that I have a great 5-part series I did with the Daily Wire on China and the corrupt American establishment called The Enemy Within. And the production values, I mean, it's beautiful. They did a tremendous job, and I tried to live up to the excellent work they did. So I'm the host of the series, and I hope that that your viewers check it out.
It's all available now?
It's a 5-part series with the Daily Wire called The Enemy Within. So please, I hope your excellent audience will check it out. If they haven't had enough of me already today.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll see, won't we?
We'll see.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks a lot.